Today, we're going to take a quick look at the most popular decks, the top performing decks, and some off-meta decks that are putting up some reasonable stats in a post-Alioth nerf Marvel stat metagame. Let's jump to it. While Alioth's total play rate is down, it is still a key piece in a number of the decks we're going to go over today, starting with the most popular deck in the format currently, what I refer to as Elsa Movers. This deck list is looking to establish some combination of its early powerful 2-drops in Angela, Elsa Bloodstone, and Craven in tandem with cards that can move around the board to benefit all of the above. Nightcrawler, Jeff, Silk, Spider-Man, and Vision can all be deployed into an Angela path or getting powered up from Elsa Bloodstone, and they can then jump to another location, potentially one with Craven in it, making him larger and making space for another card to either get buffed by Elsa or power up Angela in the path in which she's played. A lot of the strength that this deck brings to the table is the uncertainty that it has on the final turn of the game for your opponent. So many of your cards are free to move around the board that when you combine things like Vision and Jeff with top-end finishers like Alioth and Doctor Doom, it's very difficult for your opponent to accurately predict what permutation your power is going to end up in, and at worst, you end up in a coin flip spot in a lot of situations where your opponent's going to be forced to call when behind, often meaning that you're going to end up winning a solid amount of cubes with this deck. The second most popular deck according to Untap.gg stats, so their Elsa variation, but this one is not playing the Alioth. Again, we see a trio of powerful 2-drops, Elsa, Angela, as well as Collector, as cards that have low energy costs that scale up into big amounts of power on the board in the mid to late game. The big thing I would say this particular deck has going for it over the previous Movers deck that we looked at is this one has more slots for disruptive elements. We have Luke Cage, Mobius, and Mobius, as well as Cosmo that all interact with what the opponent has going on. And then the remaining slots in this deck are dedicated towards making our Collector scale large as our third 2-drop with tools like Snowguard, Agent Coulson, and even Loki, providing us with some random utility that makes it difficult for the opponent to guess what we're doing while also making the Collector grow quite large. Our third most popular deck, according to Untap.gg stats, is simply this classic Destroy deck. Post X23 release, these 12 cards have really cemented themselves as being kind of the tried and true Destroy variation. It's worth noting that the recent Forge change definitely feels like a buff to this deck in my mind. While getting +3 on the Deadpool was nice on occasion, Forge costing just 1 energy now means it fits in cleanly on your curve in a lot of spots where its previous 2 energy iteration just wouldn't have worked out. For my own personal preference when playing this deck list, I've been cutting the copy of Death for a copy of Luke Cage. This means we don't have a card that gets turned off by opposing Mobius, and it gives the deck counterplay into opposing copies of Shadow King, but it is worth noting that the top performing list and most popular on Untap is just these stock 12 cards with no fancy tech cards like I prefer. Moving along for the most popular decks on Untap.gg to some of the ones that have the highest performing average cube gains in the post-infinite ladder, we're kicking off with none other than Classic Sarah. I wasn't surprised to see this deck list coming back into prominence. I'm someone that's been definitely on the side of this deck list is much better in a post-Mobius world, while this deck's namesake, Sarah, obviously gets turned off by opposing copies of Mobius. You're generally going to know when your opponent has a Mobius in play, meaning in those games you just don't play Sarah on 5, and having a copy of Mobius for yourself, like this deck is playing, means this deck no longer just gets locked out of the game by opposing disruptive cards like Wave. The power in this deck is its flexibility to play lots of big stat lines with cards like Angela, Elsa, Bishop, and Hitmonkey in tandem with cards that are incredibly disruptive, such as Shadow King, Shang-Chi, and Luke Cage. Up next in the top performing category, we have the return of the Queen, both Shuri and Kitty Pryde coming back in force thanks to Elsa Bloodstone, giving you a way to get Kitty back that potent stat line. This deck list has a lot of the raw power output that the traditional Sauron Shuri decks have, because sometimes you just go Shuri into Red Skull into Taskmaster, but the big upside that this build has that the Sauron decks typically don't is that you're really good at ducking priority in the games where you're scaling up your copy of Kitty Pryde, because Kitty Pryde essentially let your big stats sit in your hand, and then on the final turn, you play out to 2 different paths with Kitty and Taskmaster, making it difficult for your opponent to interact with. Not only is Elsa Bloodstone giving this deck new life, but it's also worth noting that the wave decks have mostly been pushed out of the format by Mobius, meaning this deck is in a better spot than it was before. Rounding out our top performing deck list for the week, we have a fun mashup of Hela and Lockjaw. This deck list uses both of these cards to get lots of big stats into play without spending actual energy on them. We can utilize Blade and Lady Sif to discard expensive big setted things such as Magneto, the Infinite, and Death. And then Lockjaw can spin our cards like Blade and Lady Sif into other big setted things coming directly out of our deck. The one thing that I think is really innovative and neat about this particular deck list that I snagged off of Untap.gg is that it's leveraging Silver Samurai alongside things like Jubilee and White Tiger as another way to kind of guarantee we discard big things without ever risking that we discard our Hela, taking it from a gamble to a sure thing when we have that Hela in hand. Our next 3 deck lists this week are in a new category that I'm still workshopping a final title for, but let's call them off-meta medium this first week. Essentially, these deck lists are ones that they don't have high enough stats that they belong in the top performing category. They don't have enough meta share to belong in the most popular decks, but they have like reasonable, respectable stats, and they're very different from the first 6 decks that I listed here today. So if you're someone that's looking for something that's a little bit off the beaten path that can keep up with everything else we listed so far, I think these 3 decks are great choices. Our first off-meta medium is the return of a Zabu Darkhawk variation, a deck that had previously been pushed out of the metagame by Wave's popularity. Mobius's release means that Wave has been reined in, and these decks that are looking to play multiple cards in the final turn to the game can really have some breathing room to exist in the metagame again. You'll note that while this deck list isn't playing its own copies of Mobius, we are playing Rogue as one of our handful of tech cards here that can take an opposing Mobius off the board to unlock our Zabu's cost reduction. Rogue also works well against opposing copies of Luke Cage because we're playing Marvel Snap's latest card release in the Man-Thing as a 4 energy card that Zabu can reduce. Speaking of things that are new to Marvel Snap, Black Widow was buffed in our most recent Over There update as well, so she's making an appearance here alongside Korg and Rockslide as ways to keep our opponent's deck large, so our deck's main stat stick, Darkhawk, can put big numbers into play for us. Our next off-meta medium is the only wave deck I have in this week's video, and that is this Prison Ramp deck. The more astute among you that have been following the metagame changes we've gone through will note that this deck list is essentially the Galactus variation we saw being popular before that card was nerfed down to 5 stats. Essentially what this deck is looking to do is it sets up a prison-style lockout in one lane with Professor X, either with the information that Daredevil can provide or by simply ramping him out ahead of curve, catching your opponents off guard thanks to Electro or Wave. And then we follow up this prison-style lockout with another powerful card winning one of the other 2 paths, either an Alioth to blow away the opponent's plays where you're already ahead, or Orca just putting 16 stats into a path with a single card. Our final off-meta medium this week is this Thanos Control variation that has some parallels to the previous Prison Ramp deck that we looked at. We have Psylocke as well as Thanos' Time Stone that can accelerate us into a Professor X, but this deck has a little bit better of a backup plan in my opinion, because you can just kind of play stones to the board, getting big stats with either Elsa Bloodstone or something like Blue Marvel. One kind of amusing tech card that I'd be interested to see if we still need long term in this format is Leader, as a card you can deploy in a path outside of where you think your opponent is going to Alioth, so you can Alioth their Alioth back in the games where they have priority and you don't. As far as my own personal picks go for this week, I have just one for you all because when this deck is good, I tend to just spend a lot of time playing it, not exploring other things, and that is the Darkhawk Bounce deck is back in force thanks to Black Widow as well as Forge's buffs really feeling like they take it to another level. If you missed my recent highlight with this deck, it was out at the end of last week. Be sure to check that out for a full breakdown and some game action with everything this fantastically fun list has going on. All in all, playing Marvel Snap since the OTA update and poring over all the information on Untapped.gg for this meta report, I gotta say, the format seems like it's in a pretty good spot overall. While Alioth is definitely still present in the metagame, it's no longer present in over half of the decks that I'm highlighting in videos like this one. We have older decks like Sarah and Zabu pushing their way back into the metagame with appropriate adjustments now that they have a tool like Mobius to help them keep up with previously oppressive cards like Wave. Overall, I'd love to know what you all have been playing at home in the comments down below. And as always, if you enjoyed my takes on this topic, be sure to snap that like button to help this video reach some more people. As always, thanks for watching all the way through the end, and hopefully we'll see you back again real soon.